Sri Aurobindo is describing the evolution of the spiritual being out of the mental. And in order to appreciate where we are in that process of nature's evolution, he takes a brief review of what nature has done across the last perhaps a few million years to help the human being to grow conscious of the inner realms and prepare him for the spiritual awakening. We saw four broad lines of this inward awakening. First, religion. Second, occultism. Third, spiritual philosophy. And fourth, the direct experience of things. These four, we have seen, have a complex relationship between them. Sometimes one predominates, sometimes it denies others, suppresses them, sometimes they merge and then split apart. And in the portion we are now reading, in this paragraph, he describes the early phase of emergence of religion. In the portion we read last time, he described fine stages in which the early primitive human mind begins with a vague sense of the infinite and invisible surrounding the physical being, the sense of his limitation, the sense of impotence of the human mind and will, and that there is something greater concealed behind the appearances of the world. And then he describes step by step how this unfolds. What is important to observe here is he also describes the dynamic of this stage with the emergence of the mind. What will happen later, and that will be in the next paragraph, he will describe how when mind emerges, it begins to suppress all these things. So it is a first phase where there is this early perception, vague sense of the infinite and invisible. There's a tendency to then enter in relation with this power that is felt behind appearances, behind nature's processes, and then even to enter in a relationship with them where you can engage them, call upon their help, or send them away if they hinder what you need. And as this relationship grows, you have the early forms of occultism which emerge. And all the while, there is also an underlying, perhaps early form of spiritual experience of these things. These three things are working together: the religious forms, the occult power and symbolism involved, and some kind of a basic, crude spiritual perception. These three merging together, it's almost difficult to separate them. When the intellect emerges and attempts to organize what it has so far experienced and used, there are two stages. First, when it takes that knowledge, the observations, and makes a science, maybe a crude science, or maybe an occult science, which is still rooted primarily in the experience. And at that point, it is organized, it is even greatly amplified. But there's a second stage where the intellect comes into its own, and at that point, it begins to cut off, reduce, because the intellect cannot understand or cannot accept these things which are beyond its domain of logic and reason. And so it begins to suppress these things, and that's when this triple movement actually first is suppressed and then it breaks apart. Each of these takes its own different direction. Religion takes a different direction, occultism a different one, and the spiritual experience another. And intellect organizing builds something towards a spiritual philosophy at best, or simply organizes a more materialistic, superficial understanding of nature, as our current science is doing, and then finds itself unable to proceed. This whole journey, which he has described here, is very important for us to understand and appreciate. Most obviously, because we can understand the current situation in the world and the current struggle between these four lines of awakening to the inner realities. And we can see also where these four lines have brought us, and from here, how can we pick up and build to a deeper spiritual life, and from there, a spiritual evolution. But it is equally important to look at this as a past development in humanity, the details of which are not known today, especially these early parts, because it is exactly what happens in every planet, in every culture, in every cycle of development. Even on Earth, we have been through many cycles of civilization rising and falling, sometimes even as if losing everything and restarting. Always it has gone through these. So, what he describes here is a universal process, a universal phenomenon, and the variations between cultures and civilizations may be only of emphasis. But if we recognize these are the root processes, they are common to everybody, then entering any situation, any context, we're able to cut through the appearances of difference and go to the heart of what is really happening. It is equally important for us to understand what happens within us individually in our own life. As we saw last time, we all go through this phase, which is an early sensitive perception of the infinite or invisible surrounding our physical being in our childhood. And it may take different forms in different people, and the fourfold opening may take again distinct variations according to one's temperament, but that they are common to all of us gives us a key to understand this whole developmental process of the human being. As little children, we have all experienced, for example, the fear of the dark. You're walking in a patch where there is nobody, there's not enough light, and momentarily you have a sense as if you're being watched. Everybody has experienced this. You try to struggle with it. Either you experience a fear and accept that something is watching you, which opens you then to an occult perception if that develops, or you make a ritual now to protect yourself, which may take certain forms of repeating a name of protection or making certain gestures which for you will ward off an attack, which takes the form of a religious ritual. Or somebody else, more sensitive, may even try to feel what is this thing that's interested in me? What does it want? And it may open it to a more direct experience also of some kind, maybe a deeper aspect of occultism or just a spiritual recognition that there are things and that's about it. It doesn't concern me. But if at that time the reason dominates, it can suppress all these three tendencies. And it can bring you to a kind of a hard disbelief, which is your protection, or which is your means of protection, which immunizes you by desensitizing, and which could be the fourth way also. And then you could reduce it to a very superficial psychology that it is part of human nature to feel afraid of the unknown, and that's all it is, nothing else. Which of these four, or which combination, or what particular variation will vary from person to person. But if we recognize these four at the core, we can recognize the distinct character of each person. So, similarly, he describes how there is a tendency to want to communicate, to appreciate, to call upon, or to ward off some of these supraphysical influences. Perhaps there are perceptions or need for developing a supraphysical perception, which may then emerge. All of this also we have gone through in our childhood or at certain stage in our emergence into reason. I remember when I was about 10 or 11, I had access here to many books which Panditji had and many books which would come for review. And there was automatically, because of a particular bent of mind, a need to read and understand what is the basis of this occult knowledge. What is it? What is the science behind it? What makes it function? What makes it effective? How does it work? Somebody moves a few stones or recites a few words and there is a change in the weather. What's the link? It doesn't make sense to the reason. So a mind which has a turn towards reason, but supported by a consciousness that is sensitive enough to recognize that these things are real, will then try to bridge the two. There's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes in his conversation, or in Pavitrada's conversation with him, he explains certain things about current science and where it falls short, what next will happen in the emergence of science. This is in 1928 or 29. And then Sri Aurobindo says there is a great difference between the mold of mind of a scientist and an occultist. And there is no doubt that one who can bridge these two molds will lead science to great discoveries. And then he gives, he says, for instance, and he gives two things which to the occult mind will open many possibilities. One of them is that atoms are similarly structured to a solar system. Now, this is something we've all read in our childhood. Little electrons spinning around a core. Here you have planets spinning around the sun. The fact that there is a similar structure, the more reasoning mind will say, yes, that's how it should be, or it will not even, if it's not even curious, it doesn't think much. But the occult turn of mind immediately sees, the macro and the micro are similar. And it perceives behind that a deeper truth. That what's happening there is reflected here, and what's happening here is reflected there. It begins to sense the connection. The reason, which is more materialistic, will say this is big, this is small, there is no connection. But the occult mind, which senses behind appearances, senses a resonance, a link, a continuum in reality, and then recognizes, yes, that means I can do something here and influence the planets there. And all these perceptions begin to open out. They're still crude, they're still unverified, they're difficult to replicate. Once it happened, when there was something which was about to happen, I lifted my finger and said no, or I spoke a certain word, I repeated a mantra, and the result changed. Can I repeat it? So it happens to children. You're watching a football match, you have a side that you wish to win, and at the moment when it's in danger, you repeat a prayer, and suddenly the game turns. For a moment, the reasoning mind will say, did it happen because I prayed? And something deeper says, yes, of course it happened because I prayed. And there's a struggle between these two. And then you make a test. You repeat it a second time. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, then if you swing to the reductionist reason, you may say, it was a fluke. But something inside you still calls. Or it happened, but it almost didn't happen. And you know that you are misusing a power. And you instinctively, and that's the occult or spiritual intuition, which says, I can do it, but if I keep doing it, then something says, enough, you're not allowed to misuse it. And so I should reserve the power, reserve the energy for when it's actually necessary. And all of these are intuitions which come up. They may get formalized in the thinking mind that is still aligned to this experience. And in a culture, going down a few generations, if it is passed on, then you will be taught, here's a mantra, there's a great power, but you have to use it judiciously, only when you absolutely need. And if you use it too often, you lose the power behind it. Once you've accepted this logically, there must be a way to build the power behind it. What are the times? What are the methods by which you would build on it? And so on. All of this very quickly takes on a form which is almost a practice of an occult knowledge. And if there is this faculty of intuition and instinct, then it can lead very quickly to things which may not always stand the test of reason, but which may still be effective and work for you, and maybe they don't work for someone else. So I had this recently. I was in a conference where many people presented their wares. As it happens in the United States, often, even if there's a conference on a scientific approach to subtle phenomena, people come of all kinds, and each one wants to sell their thing. And there was one group which came. I met the founder of that group, and she seemed to be extremely sincere in her experience of it. And her experience was, she had a tuning fork. She struck it, and as she walked towards the patient, she felt the tone the sound change. And she found she could move it in the space around the patient, and in certain spaces, the sound would change drastically, in other spaces, less. And so she began to experiment. Now, this is not a purely scientific method, because a purely scientific method would have to attempt over 1,000 people with all kinds of illnesses and then create a map which is truly universal. But she started with the patient she had. This fellow had some illness and she detects points here. So she maps those points to that illness, which may or may not be entirely true. It may be something else that is picked up. We don't know. But to her, it was enough. And she began to build a whole system around this experience. And she found it very effective. She could now diagnose new patients with a tuning fork in their aura. Its pitch changes. And then it went on to teaching others. Inevitably, it has to take that form. So she now teaches people, this is the space, this is the location, this is the way it shifts. And then people start applying it. Of course, it is not a scientific study in the sense that there was no validation across people. Each one was given a method and they were given a reference which was perhaps too general, but it worked. It helped people, it helped patients. She was able to cure them using this. Now, this is where the science comes. And a reasoning science says, well, we must try it out. We must check whether this mapping is consistent with the same patient, but tested by different users, by different healers. Or if two different patients have the same shift in resonance at a particular point, do they have the same illness? We should be able to validate this. And it does not work. And there's the part where the reasoning science will say, yes, then it's too subjective or it's unreal, it's an error. But the occult element, which she had spontaneously and her students had, it gave them results and there was an outcome. Just because it was not consistent to the science does not mean that it's not right. And at that point, the science could extend perhaps, and this is a suggestion I offer, that when the patient is approached by the person intending to sense, the representation of the illness need not necessarily take on a fixed place. It may take in a different place because the way the illness represents itself in the aura may vary person to person. It may have a different meaning for the person. For a person, the same physical form of illness may represent the past pulling it, or it may represent the future, which is threatening it. And it would represent in different spaces in the aura. But the rational science does not recognize this subtlety of the occult experience. And so its validation or its boundaries would question this method, whereas the occultist experiences but cannot explain. And there is in between a kind of an explanation which is perhaps too complex for the two to meet. All this I give as examples because it helps us to understand the struggle between these domains. And especially when it comes to some of the more primitive forms, both of religious ritual as well as occultism, we may not be able to see the truth behind when in fact there is a truth. So the intuitions that he thus received by contact with nature, his mind systematized and so created the early forms of religion. This active and ready power of intuition also gave him the sense of supra-physical forces behind the physical. And his instinct and a certain subliminal or supernormal experience of supra-physical beings with whom he could somehow communicate turned him towards the discovery of effective and canalizing means for a dynamic utilization of this knowledge. So were created magic and the other early forms of occultism. And this is the sentence where we had paused for a deeper exploration. First of all, the power of intuition gives the sense of supraphysical forces behind the physical. You know it is there. You know that behind the forest or within the forest is a presence. You know that behind the activity of the volcano is a being. You know even that it is there behind the rains and even behind the sun, behind the sky, behind the earth. All these are coming from a deeper intuition, but it is not yet organized. From there is the instinct and certain subliminal or supernormal experiences of supraphysical beings. You sense the being, as we saw earlier, you feel you're being watched. But also, as you approach a mountain, you feel this mountain is so conscious, there is a solid presence there. What do you do with that knowledge? First thing the human consciousness wants to do is use it for its own benefit. So, oh mountain, when I came to you, you gave me so much peace. I come back for that peace. Or I was tired, I lay down under this tree and I felt rejuvenated. The tree gives me life, it's a healing tree. And so I build a relationship, and you build around it a whole pattern of symbols or rituals. What do I do? How do I thank the tree which healed? I must give something back. What could the mountain want? It doesn't need anything. What does the tree need? Perhaps water. I could give it water, or I could give it love and affection. But some form of giving builds this relationship of exchange. And as the exchange begins, the sense of intimacy with that presence also grows. Now, each time I come to the tree, it is my friend. It has helped me so many times, and I have opened my heart to it. I can share my secrets with it. And each time I share the burden, he takes away the burden. If the sensitivity grows, one even has a perception that there's a being there in the tree. And it's a very compassionate, deep being. You feel that, and you cannot question that experience. It's so vivid. I can share a personal experience I had. For a long time, this whole perception of the presence in trees or in nature was somewhat closed. And I felt uncomfortable opening to it because it felt as if something inferior, different from the spiritual consciousness, which should be the one pointed goal. And somewhere along the way, it felt as if I should be able to now reach and experience this. So I was at a particular stage in my concentration. I happened to have a couple of days, 2 or 3 days alone, and it was in a very beautiful garden in front of my friends. So I said, okay, let me do a kind of a concentrated practice. And I spent a whole day in concentration, dwelling on the deeper presence behind appearances. At the end of the day, let's say about 6 to 8 hours of this effort, it came to a point where the consciousness was deeply interiorized, and I was walking in the garden with this intention. And as I approached one of the trees, I felt the branches of the trees which were in my direction gently move and sway up and down. I saw it. There was no obvious wind. The other branches didn't move. And immediately the consciousness turned to what is it that is reaching out. And there was at that moment an experience of the being that was the tree. I thought I was extremely quiet after a sustained concentration for so long. But what I experienced in the being of the tree was at least 100 times more quiet, 100 times more still, maybe even 1,000 times more still, unimaginably still in its presence. The stillness within me was almost a violence compared to his presence and stillness. And what I had got was, after all that effort, and just that, the experience that there is this stillness possible was enough to leave such a deep imprint. Even now, when I dwell on that experience, I realize there's so much more to go to reach that level of stillness. And it is alive, it is conscious, it is active, it is expressing itself. And that movement of the branches was as if to welcome and acknowledge my presence. And looking at it in that way, there was a series of as if communications of what I needed to do or what was necessary. And I looked down at its roots. The tree must have been at least 100 or 200 years old. The roots which were standing above the ground, as I looked at the roots, I saw as if lines of light radiating along. Not on the roots, but as if moving, and they were rippling on the ground. And I said, yes, so this is what they call the energy flows of the earth. And it was as if given to me by the tree. It was not something I was looking for. I didn't ask. It was given, and then after a while, it faded. The perception of the presence after that never left. Even when I could approach it without that degree of stillness, I felt something, because it was as if a gateway had opened and now the access was there. And I share this as an experience because of the manner in which the communications come. It can be so compelling, so real, because they're beyond your imagination. And at that point, you have no other choice except to say yes. And it's a gift. You couldn't have got to it on your own. It was given to you. And it was a conscious being. It was a wise, old tree. And in the whole garden afterwards, when I would look around, it was the eldest, it was the elder, as if one could sense as if a relationship between the trees, somewhere really young, almost immature in their consciousness. And then there was this one who was the aged elder one, who looked at all others, knew them all in its own mature way. But all these experiences as if begin to open up, assisted by that presence, even. So, subliminal or supernormal experiences of supra-physical beings with whom he could somehow communicate turned him towards the discovery of effective and canalizing means for a dynamic utilization of this knowledge. He's using two words here, effective and canalizing means. There are many ways by which you can utilize this knowledge, but you want a means that is more effective. And so effective that even somebody who doesn't have that experience can benefit from it without that perception, without the need to develop that subtle sight or feeling, offering and ask for its help. And maybe that's good enough for you. But there is something else. The second word he uses, canalizing means. What is this sense of canalizing? It's as if you have a whole spread of possibilities of experience, like rain which comes. But then the water is canalized. It is concentrated in a passage where it becomes more intense. So the rain may be very light. You had perhaps half an hour of light drizzle, but the stream in which all the drops have been canalized has swelled up to double its size. So canalizing is this movement of the larger perception sensed, now concentrated into a narrow focus that allows something more powerful, more intense. If you can, for example, catch the sum total of the full day's gathered presence, that would be the moment when you catch it. The time when the sun sets, perhaps, or the full night's gathered concentration, the moment just before the sun rises. That might be the moment to catch. So we have this tradition of waking up early. 4 o'clock is the time given as an indication for meditation or for prayer. The hour before the gods awake, as Sri Aurobindo puts in Savitri. But it's the time when all the pregnant, deep silence or peace of the night is most condensed, most densely felt. Catch it at that moment and you can canalize the full power of it. Perhaps that's the experience. Or there are other ways in which you could canalize by representing, gathering in a narrow cup. So, in a ritual, a religious ritual, for example, you will find somebody takes a cup and offers it, raises it to the sky, invoking something. That thing which is already there in the sky is now asked to be condensed into a cup. And there's a canalizing, a narrowing, intensifying in the focus, which then you may partake or you may share. I point to these gestures as they are almost common across all cultures, across all religions in their symbolism. There are many common features. One of those is the relationship we have to the sun. Every religion, every culture has had this relationship where the sun represented either the spiritual truth or the source of life or the divine in some form or a divine being on whom the whole earth and all life on earth depends, whatever the form it was. To put yourself in relation with the sun was somehow considered important. There's even a very interesting question put to Sri Aurobindo where he gives a reply that links to the sun. Someone asks, how do you explain the different styles of writing in different cultures? Some go left to right, some write right to left, as in the Arabic tradition, or some go vertically, top down, as in the Japanese or Chinese. You do not find a bottom up anywhere. Interesting. But left to right, right to left, top to down. What's the point? What's the difference? There must be some reason why they are like this. And Sri Aurobindo's answer, this is in the Arya, his answer is perhaps it has to do with the movement of the sun in relation to the direction in which the culture faced. Interesting. He says perhaps, and one would tend to think that Sri Aurobindo uses perhaps only because that's necessary when what he's revealing is too far beyond validation. But otherwise, he wouldn't say it. It's because he has already, by that time he was writing the Arya, he had the vision of all the past phases of civilizational development. So, a civilization which is facing the sun, as the sun rises, would tend to represent the movement of unfolding of truth, unfolding of knowledge, unrolling, so to say, in a vertical manner on the paper. Japan, as you know, has even the sun as its emblem in its flag, and it's even refers to its empire as Empire of the Sun. The king is representative of the sun, and so on. So this facing of the sun is interesting because in the large landmass of the earth, it is the easternmost. And so when the sun rises on earth generally, it's the first patch of land that hits on which it hits. If you look at the whole mass of the earth as one largely centered around this patch, at the precise center of the landmass of the earth, which should be the geographic center, incidentally, are the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Very interesting. And it's not by chance. In the old days, the civilizations had a deeper connection among them, and certain interventions were made on the earth to, as if, connect the earth to the higher realms through physical symbols. And so that was one of the reasons. In the Indian landmass, you will see from the Himalayas down, that's how they describe it. It's as if you slide down from the peaks where the Ganga flows down, the whole energy, the spiritual energy flows down from the north to south. And so naturally the sun rising from the left to the right would be the movement of the script. And I don't know enough about the Arabic space, but there must have been a certain movement facing up towards the north, because of which they would see the sun going right to left. I'm putting this as an example because some of these things are so lost in antiquity that we don't even know the source. But there is a rationale, and it has to do with these perceptions, subtler, deeper insights or perceptions of an early humanity, which has still that very first awakening of man to a rudimentary spiritual consciousness, beginning with a vague sense of the infinite and the invisible surrounding. We have another common feature almost across all religions, which is the lighting of the lamp, the flame. And inevitably, it has to symbolize for you dispelling darkness. All awakening, all spirituality involves the sense of a rising out of darkness, being free of ignorance to a greater consciousness. The sense of a greater consciousness subjectively is I'm more aware, more awake, more conscious, and as if light. The sense of losing that higher consciousness is experienced subjectively as a fall into a kind of a dullness, darkness, inertia, or even for one in whom this higher sight has opened, it's a losing of sight and becoming blind. So you have, as a result of a ritual or a process of concentration, prayer, risen to this consciousness where literally you feel as if you can see and sense these deeper realities, and then you lose that poise, and the experience is as if you've become blind to this inner or higher realm or state of consciousness. So the sense of light is associated with higher consciousness subjectively. Of course, there's a deep truth to it, which Aurobindo says all light ultimately is the spiritual light. Even the physical light is as if a reflection of the spiritual light in a sensory physical experience. If you think about it logically, when you say some space is lit up, what does it mean? On a very physical level, it's light which has struck your retina, created electrical signals which are being processed in your brain. Where do you have the experience of light seen? Not in the retina, not in the brain. In the mind which registers this imprint. It's in mind that you have the experience of, now I can see, it's lit up, it's bright, or it's dim. So finally, it is in mind that you're seeing the experience of light. All the rest is only physical process. And in mind, what you see as light is only a reflection of the spiritual light fragmented. And that's why this light is also deceptive. It can cover, it can divide, it can separate, it can deceive, and so on. So when we consider the experience of lighting a lamp, inevitably across all traditions, it represents illumination that dispels darkness and so lifts you to a higher consciousness, or represents within you that movement of a rising consciousness or your rising aspiration. In the very physical character of it, the flame is such that you can never make it move downward. It's interesting, isn't it? You can turn a candle upside down, but the flame will still go around and point up and say, this is the way, the divine is there. So it becomes almost a perfect symbol of our aspiration. However much you may try to distort, pervert, or change your frame of reference, the aspiration will still turn around and point and say, this way, this is up, this is the divine. And so the sense of lighting the flame acquires now a much deeper symbol, which then the occult will use in a different way, the religious will use in a different way. In the religion, it will be, oh, you must go and light the flame if you want to really wake up in your consciousness, or you must light the flame if you want to see the divine. In the religious symbol, in many of the Indian temples, you do not allow lights to be placed in the sanctum sanctorum. You have to light the flame, and in the light of the flame of your aspiration, you have your perception of the divine. And it becomes a perfect symbol of a spiritual truth now represented in a religious, symbolic, or ritual manner. In the occult, though, it may have a very different meaning or a much deeper meaning. In the occult, it may mean that at the moment of lighting the lamp, you are assisting your own aspiration to intensify and grow. In the act of feeding the flame, your aspiration grows, becomes more intense. And the symbol now becomes obvious. What do you put in the flame? The parts which are not burnt, the parts which are not burning, the parts which need to be purified or sublimated. And so the act of putting something in the flame is the act of putting something of you that needs now to be sublimated or purified. And so the whole external form of the ritual has a deep inner symbol, which may be a spiritual symbol, but now has an occult effect on you and on the environment also. So one of the things you would do as part of that occult knowledge, something which is dark, something which is opposed to light, something which is harmful, would be taken and put into the flame. Because it's the best way to transmute the elements. Again, one comes back to this interesting observation, and they relate to the 4 elements, eventually to the 5, that if you have an object which is harmful, you can break it up. But it's just become pieces. It's not really gone away. You can wash it and it will get diluted, dispersed perhaps, but again, it's still there somewhere. You can blow it away, throw it into the wind, and maybe that's your best way to lose it into the larger, wider atmosphere. but it's still there. But when you put it into the flame, the fire decomposes the molecular structure, breaks constituent elements, and the form of that wrong or dark or error is gone, to be replaced by something which is more pure, more true, more real, more essential. So fire purifies, nothing else purifies as fire does. And so automatically fire becomes also a symbol to purify a wrong, to set right a wrong, to ward off an evil or to neutralize the evil or transmute the evil into good. And all these are variations of the action of the flame, depending on the particular need, and you would have variations of ritual around this. But the principle behind that is very simple, perceived by this early intuition, and then given to it a more elaborate and ritualistic form, where a culture does not have possibility of lighting a fire or cannot do it easily. You would do an equivalent thing which would replace this. A similar idea is there in the sense of meeting the ocean. When you meet this very large body of water, what do you find there? Anything put into the ocean goes away into the infinite because it has no boundary, no limit. And so the ocean becomes a symbol of the meeting point between the infinite and the finite. So many spontaneously use this, even scientists. I believe it was Newton who said that I've only played with pebbles on the shores of the sea of knowledge, something like that. But the idea that the ocean represents something immense, vast, even infinite, is spontaneously there to our intuition. So putting into the ocean becomes symbolic of merging into the divine. So often when a person has passed away and you have, after the cremation, what remains is put into the ocean, because physically the symbol is all that remains of the person must now dissolve into the divine. Where you don't have an ocean, what do? You pick the closest equivalent. It may be a flowing river, which goes to the ocean. So you don't have the ocean, but this is going to take it all the way to the ocean, even if symbolically you have initiated that movement which will lead it all the way to the ocean. Where you don't have a river, what do? The closest equivalent would be a pond. So you will place it in water where it disperses. Or if the pond is too small, or you're at the top of a mountain where even the pond might not be, what do? The symbol for you at that point is scattering into the wind. So the ashes are scattered into the wind, which opens out to the infinity of the sky. Something which represents infinity, which represents the sky, is always there. And if nothing else, if you're in the desert without a strong breeze or ocean, the earth becomes the infinite, and you bury it, disperse it into the soil which is below you. All of these are examples of how the perception turns and gives to it a form. I mentioned last time one more, and I promised to dwell on that. It's an interesting one. The sense of three. In every tradition, you will find a repeating three times is somehow embedded in every ritual. In the fairy tales, or in many of those actually are distortions of some deeper symbols. You have the three little pigs, and there's the wolf. They make a house which is made of hay. He burns it. Then they make a house which is of wood, and he breaks it in house of stone, and then he cannot break it. Always three, and the third is successful. Why this sense of three? A repetition of a mantra three times. You say Om Shanti, peace, you repeat three times. Why three? If you think about it, it comes from this intuition, this deeper intuition, and you see how. Let's say you're sitting in a space where you're asking for an indication. Should I should do? Tell me if it is right. And suddenly at that moment, there's a sound, a knock. Was that you telling me? I don't know. I cannot be sure. As I'm sitting, a leaf falls. Is that the signal you're giving me? I cannot be sure, because it could be by chance. So the first is always by chance. So I ask, is this what you want me to notice? Is this the indication? That's your second time you ask. And another leaf falls, or another knock, or whatever symbol you're looking for. Ah, yes, this is certainly not by chance. But is this it? One final confirmation is required to take it from a chance occasion. And so the third comes, and there it seals it. You do not need fourth, fifth, sixth. That would be an exaggeration. If you hear it particularly as a sound, or if you're calling somebody who's hard of hearing, you call once, the person hesitates. Did I hear the voice? I'm not sure. He waits, he doesn't hear it again, he goes back to work. Second time the voice comes, someone calls from far. I think I've heard someone calling for help. I'm not sure. But he starts paying attention. This time he stays waiting, not for a few, but longer. And because he's receptive and waiting, the third one is heard clearly, and it seals the communication. Yes, I heard right. I will come. The same thing happens when you reach out to your own inner subliminal spaces. You're calling for help to the presence within. But consider how much of the clutter of your thoughts are calling for need. I need to know this, I need to have this, I need to own this, I need. There's a clutter in your surface personality. And the inner junk out there. Too many desires, too many calls, too much confusion of thought. But then when you make a conscious, intense call, I need to know this, help me to get this knowledge. The first call goes in, but it's part of a clutter. It may at best touch something deeper and evoke it to respond. Oh, there must be some need out there, a stirring first. And it looks, what is there? Oh, nothing particular repeated. It might quiet. You make a second call. At that point, it touches and perhaps goes more deeply, and it says, ah, yes, what is it you want? And the third time, the message is clear. The sense of three is felt spontaneously to this deeper, subliminal, intuitive feel. And from here comes the need for the repetition 3 times to fix. If you're communicating to the subliminal and subconscious realms, the 3 is what always completes the communication. So we've touched upon a few examples of these. You find you work towards discovery of effective and canalizing means for a dynamic utilization of this knowledge. And here are so many examples by which you have amplified, made effective. At some time, now a new shift happens in this whole awakening to the infinite or unseen behind appearances. All this while, it was a turning outward. At some time, it must have dawned on him that he had something in him which was not physical, a soul that survived the body. So the dawning happens when there is a rarefication of the inner consciousness sufficiently that you can distinguish, I am not just body, but there's something else, a soul. And he's not obviously speaking of the deepest soul, but some core of consciousness which is separate from body and which could survive. Certain supernormal experiences which became active because of the pressure to know the invisible must have helped to formulate his first crude ideas of this entity within him. So he's not only giving you a narration of the historical process or a description of what happens in us, he's giving you the key of how it happens. When he says that the supernormal experiences became active because of the pressure to know the invisible. That's your key. And this is at the core of all opening of the inner realms, of all inner sight, of all inner occult powers or capacities which are latent in all of us without exception. As long as you're in denial, oh, it's not there, it's impossible. You're too busy exercising your capacities outward. The moment you accept that there is something within, you want to know. Now, if your call to knowing is casual, then of course you have a casual experience. Too subtle, too mixed to be decisive. But if your call is intense, I need to feel this, I want to know this, the intensity of the call is what provokes the experience. So, supernormal experiences which became active because of the pressure to know the invisible. When the pressure to know is intense, it triggers the activity of these supernormal experiences. Otherwise, they're all there, but they are latent or they are not registered by you. The call is triggering and making it appear more and more frequently. What is interesting here is just the fact that you pay attention is enough to kickstart the process. When somebody, for example, starts studying palmistry or astrology or one of these sciences of divination, whatever you start doing, you're trying to reach out to a perception. The very fact that you're trying to reach it out and putting it into practice tends to hone and intensify that perception and the skill of that perception, isn't it? The first time you do it, it was almost like a fluke. Oh, it's surprising, it worked. Let me try it again. And the second time, a little more. Or you lose it and then it comes back. You go back and forth. But the fact that you persist, you pay attention, you accept, you call, you reach out, evokes and draws out that whole capacity. And then makes it more and more skilled, more and more refined. And then at some point, it is there almost on call. I remember, again, it is an example of a group in Japan which have developed this as part of their lineage, that they offer what they call a form of meditation. You sit down and remain open. The priest sits before you. They go through a certain ritual of invocation. They make certain gestures and words. And then they describe what it is that they perceive. And often what they perceive is symbolic representation of a difficulty you may be going through in your life, which then reflects in their mind and comes forward. It would be equivalent to doing a tarot reading or some such, but it's much more flexible, much more fluid. For example, one of the readings they gave somebody was the moon, and there is a shadow that seems to cover the moon. But the shadow cannot last, it will pass. Now, the description could mean anything because it's symbol. But to that person, it evokes immediately a resonance with the current difficulty that he or she would go through. And he's, yes, this is what it is. Thank you for that guidance. It was helpful. The symbol was just right. And the person who is reflecting it may not know. So I saw this happening. There were 4 of them doing it, and we were all a group of people. They were doing it to everybody. And the thing which was said to me was useful, it was helpful, it was insightful, but it didn't lead to a deeper insight than something which I already knew. But the second time when we met with that group and they did a reading, he said something very specific, and it went to the core of a situation. He said, there's somebody who has as if become a martyr. And he's now he's attaching himself to you and needs help. And he wants to be freed, but he's as if pulling you into a similar movement of martyrdom. And I said, it doesn't make sense to me. But then when I went into circumstances, that situation, it caught something so precisely. It was amazing. So then I said, okay, here's something which can go beyond what I'm consciously aware of. And so the third time we met with that group, we had the reading, somebody came and did it. It was not as profound, but the person who had done the earlier readings, he was as if the head of that group. He was the master in a way, or the most skilled. I went up to him and I said, last time you had said this, it helped me. And there and then, standing before me in a casual conversation, he did what he does through the ritual process and said certain things which were again an exact, precise description and with it a guidance, which was very helpful for me. It allowed me to avoid a lot of difficulties. But what I saw was, here was a go through that process of making gestures and invocations to enter the state where they were receptive like a mirror and they were able to reflect a certain guidance. But the man who was most developed, who would teach them, obviously, Didn't need to go through that. He still did it because that was the tradition, but he didn't need it. He could just put himself into that state and intuitively catch and reflect. The point is, initially, you may use a process to draw out. And this is where so many occult traditions are confused. They think this is the way to do it. This is the incantation you have to use. This is the ritual. This is the gesture by which you have access to that power. No, it's not so. The call to the power, the need to know and feel and grow is the call, is the means. And that procedure is only your way of concentrating your call and giving it a form, direction, and focus. Remember that word he used earlier? Discovery of effective and canalizing means. You want the effect to grow, but you want to canalize, concentrate. And what better way than to repeat to yourself, almost as if in a prayer, that which needs to be affirmed, to be drawn out. And if you want to be a perfect mirror, you cannot do that by saying, I want to be a mirror, isn't it? What would you do to become a mirror? To still yourself, to remove the you, that's when you can reflect. And what's the best way to still yourself? Put yourself in relation to that which is infinite, which is greater than you. And so it becomes as if a prayer to God. And it may take a form which says, make me an instrument, make me a mirror, that I may reflect, that your will or your insight may reflect. It could take that form, or it could take a more physical ritual form, that you actually take a physical mirror and do something with it to represent that. In a similar vein, when I first heard that in the Shinto tradition, they don't have an idol, because you are opening out to a presence which is in nature, which is secret, which is hidden behind the forms. So in the Shinto temple, there is only this blank wooden covering, but behind that is the thing which is the real idol. And the idol is often a mirror. And of course, then the mind comes in. The intellect says, and this is how some people interpret it. So the mirror there tells you, you are the divine, or the divine is in you. And when you go stand before it, there's the veil, but behind the veil is the mirror that says the divine is in you. Maybe. Or maybe it is something more profound. That the idol there is that which reflects the divine. And the mirror is meant to reflect the divine in its universality or its transcendence through that focal point. Could be both, reflecting the divine within you or reflecting the divine beyond. Maybe all these. Especially to that mind which was not so narrowly rationalized, a simultaneous experience of many facets was natural. And that's how in early language you have root sounds which capture many meanings in a single gesture. Because you are not yet mentalized to think in narrow pieces of thought, the consciousness is much more intuitive and even instinctive, with a vital intuition which captures an experience which has always many facets and gives form to an experience. So many of these symbols have multiple facets, and they were happy to have that. But when the thinking mind comes, it must now reduce the symbol to a thought and fix it in a boundary, which often loses the force of it. And so he says, so were created magic and the other early forms of occultism. And again, you can ask, other early forms of occultism versus magic. Magic is one of the early forms of occultism. What are the other early forms of occultism? And it's interesting to see there are variations which are not so obviously magic, and yet there is an occult content to them. Magic has been defined as the capacity to render effective your will. It's a very simple definition. So, magician, what is he doing? He's exercising his will and making it effective in ways that normal people can't. Process and makes it rain. He has exercised his will. That's all that he has done. Only you try to exercise your will by taking an aeroplane that goes into the cloud and scatters these fine crystal particles to trigger the rain. You exercised your will through that process. This man found an easier way. Sitting in his house, he looks at the cloud and does an incantation which triggers the rain. He has also exercised his will by other means. So it's an occultism. Magic is occultism, or rather, exercise of will by occult means. But then there are a whole range of occult things which do not involve this exercise of will and a domination of will. So they do not come in the category of magic. One of the things we were taught as children is when you go out into nature and you're about to eat, you never eat just like that. You first take a little bit of the food and you throw it in 4 directions so that all those beings who are hungry out there may be fed first. And then only you eat. Now, behind this insight, there's a spiritual truth and there's an occult truth equally. The spiritual truth, and there's a moral aspect. Moral aspect is you give to others before you eat. And that helps to purify from your narrow ego sense. The spiritual truth behind it is that everything in the physical world is hungry. The name given to the material world is annam, which is food. It's the only world of all the worlds which is called annam, that is food, because in the very nature of matter, Sri Aurobindo explains, everything needs to eat to survive, and even as it eats, it is eaten by something else. The whole circle of life goes through matter, eating, eating, eating. Everything, therefore, is hungry. You will recall the line in Savitri where Sri Aurobindo speaks of how this world, the hunger that has created this world, in capital H. So behind that is this idea that everything in this universe is hungry. And so the act of eating is not an act that you take alone. It's an act which is a universal act. And in this movement of throwing in 4 different directions, you are as if embracing the whole universe. Why 4? Try to find a 5th which is not a product of 4. There are only 4. Try to find 3 which makes it complete. You can't. You cannot make the full sense of directions with 3 and feel that completeness. You feel something is missing, but when you take 4 directions, it feels complete. And you can add more, but there'll always be a subset of the 4. So again, it's an intuitive feel. 4 directions is how we are. Sun sets a direction. You can have east and west, but then there is exactly perpendicular to it. If you didn't have the sun, you would have the sense of 4, but with no fixed direction. The sun gives you that reference. And so automatically in the very act of the sun rising, 4 directions form. And they include all. So you throw in 4 directions. Offer, give, share, and then you eat as part of a universal satiation of hunger. That's the spiritual aspect of it. And then there's an occult aspect. When you go out into nature, there are beings out there also which are watching you. Maybe they are not interested particularly, but when you're eating, they say, what is that thing you're eating? I would like to eat it. And what happens then? So there's this story which what we are taught as children first is that if while eating somebody sees you eating and he salivates, it's as if he takes out from your food something of its energy. Or it's as if he has rendered your food impure, and when you eat that, you'll have indigestion. Because his desire has attached itself to the food, and in the act of eating, you're taking in that desire. So again, behind that would be a corrective. You would offer the food, invoke the divine presence to purify it before eating, and so on. But this idea that somebody else is attaching in desire to your food is interfering in the nourishment process and can even harm you. Now extends into that forest space where there might be beings that say, that looks like a delicious apple. Can I have a bit of it? And maybe they're invisible beings, or they're birds, or whatever else. And so what you do in the act of sharing, you satisfy them. By giving a little bit of your food, they are satisfied, they are satiated. Now nobody is bothered with your eating, and you can eat freely. I'm giving a very simple gesture which has all 3 dimensions of the moral, religious component, the occult component, and the spiritual symbol equally. And all this is done by a mind trying to explain and rationalize. Behind all these little things, you will find elements like this. So this would be an element which we could describe as form of occultism, but not really magic. It's not an attempt to exercise a will. It's just operating in the reality of deeper things which are working in the world. Similarly, I think I mentioned this last time, to never say that I will do this. It's as if you're throwing a challenge to forces which might oppose. You will see in many of the Greek stories, the hero will say, I will defy the gods. It's such a dangerous thing to do because the gods say, ah, yes, you think you're stronger than me? Let me show you. And you're calling upon yourself a whole opposing energy. But these are aspects of the occult knowledge. So at some time, it has dawned on him that there's something in him which is not physical, a soul that survived the body. And obviously, here the sense of the soul is some part of me that is not body but which survives. When somebody passes away, you have that experience that you see the body there, but now the person is not there. The person is still felt with you. The body has been now dissolved, dissipated into the universe, but the person is still there. And then after a while, you feel the person goes away. And you don't feel anymore. But at that point, if it is combined with that internal pressure to know the invisible, which calls out the supernormal experience, it makes complete, it evokes uh, the direct experience. And this is an example of a friend of mine. He had gone to complete the last rites of his grandmother who had passed away. It was in another city. And that night he comes home, goes to sleep. At 2 a.m. about, he wakes up, middle of the night. For no reason, he doesn't know why. And he finds his grandmother standing at the foot of his bed. And she's smiling. And what he described was a very pompous gesture. She raises her hand as if to bless him. And he said, why is she blessing me? That kind of feeling. And she thanks him for what he has done and says, I'm grateful for what you did. And then as part of that conversation, she says, never forget that you are part of such and such a lineage. And she names the Gotra of the family. Now, the Gotra is a very peculiar thing which today is completely ignored in modern India. But if you go back barely one generation, it was considered extremely important. The Gotra is the Rishi who is the originator of the lineage of your family. And there are only a fixed number of Rishis. And when you have weddings, marriages, you also look at the Gotra and the affinity and the compatibility of the Gotra behind, representing as if a special stream of consciousness which is transmitted in the lineage of the family. Again, this goes to a deep symbol and a deep spiritual truth and an occult truth. If nothing else, at a very material level, your body is formed from what? The cells of your mother. You're a part of your mother's body. Whether you're a boy or girl, doesn't matter, it's always born from the mother. And a part of mother's biology, who is herself part of her mother's body, who is part of her mother's body. So there is an unbroken physical continuity of cells regenerating, and the energy infused in those cells, which is the life force passing through the entire lineage. So there's a quality of energy which is actually sustained, into which other elements mix, from which they diverse, mix, etc., but something distinct in the line, purely at the level of life force. And if there's something of life force, there must be behind it, holding the life force, a mind idea, and perhaps behind it even a spiritual soul idea, perhaps. And if there is such, one could recognize it, one could give to it a name describing the quality that it represents. That's how the whole Gotra concept emerges. And so this grandmother tells my friend, remember this. And at that point, he's wondering, is this a dream? He pinches himself. He's very clearly awake. Goes back to sleep. Next morning, he has memory of the dream, and he remembers the name given, the Gotra. So he calls up his father. What is our family Gotra? And confirms it. So I give this as an example of how a supernormal experience unformed intuition. There's another interesting experience we had, and this was when I was driving back from, I was driving to the airport from Narad's house. He had asked for a driver to pick me up. The man was in a very conservative country, very limited in perspective normally to a narrow form of the religion. That's what we would expect. But this man was unusually open. And he began to talk. He was curious about things, about yoga and other things. And he says, I believe there is more to life than just what we are told. And at some point, he felt sufficiently comfortable to share an experience. And he said, I've not said this to anybody other than his immediate family. The sum of the story was this, and it happened within his family, that a woman had lost her husband. And after a few months after his passing, she had found herself getting interested in somebody else, another man, and she was feeling guilt. Somebody in a different family known to them wakes up and has an apparition where the voice of that person, the form of that person appears and tells her, please call up my ex-wife and tell her it's okay to be friends with so and so. She wakes up from her dream sleep experience. She lifts the phone and calls up that woman and says, do you know somebody by such and such a name? And the other woman has a shock, and then she conveys her story. And this man, it's happening in his family. So he says, I cannot deny it. Oh, I think it was to him that it happened. He had that experience. He had the dream and he had to call up. He said, how do I explain this? The fact that you have had a supernormal experience of this kind, which can be totally validated by facts, and there was no way for you to know, there was no interest for you to know, is enough to shock a person into wakefulness to the recognition that reality is greater. And with that begins this gentle pressure to know what is there within me in my capacity. Is there something, if I see things surviving there, obviously within me also something survives, and so on. And that begins a chain. So must have helped to formulate his first crude ideas of this entity within him. So you have had an experience of someone surviving after death, or maybe I also survive after death. Would I have a body? Would I have... It would only be later that he began to realize that what he perceived in the action of the universe was also there in some form within him. And that in him also were elements that responded to invisible powers and forces for good or for evil. So now if there's a soul that survives within me, you also recognize eventually that everything out there has a corresponding thing in me. I sense an invisible out there, there is an invisible within me. I sense an infinite out there. There's also perhaps a sense of the infinite or the eternal within me. And so the sense of correspondence between these two is the next step in the evolution. Again, this is very important because it represents literally stages in which a person can be initiated or drawn into a deeper spiritual life through such an experience. You start by complete denial of all in a reductionist, materialist experience of reality. First thing you have to have is a perception out. Second step will be the perception of something within you, which is more permanent, or a soul, a deeper truth of I. The third thing will be a correspondence between what is outside and what is inside. And then elements that responded to invisible powers for good or for evil. So if everything out there has its corresponding thing also within, then the good out there has its corresponding good within, and the evil out there has its corresponding evil within. And if you have become sufficiently conscious, you even experience the anger entered from outside and possessed me. I did not want to be angry, but I experienced it entering and seizing me. And it seized the part in me which had this dislike or anger towards a certain person. And so I realized that within me was an element that resonated or which made me vulnerable to that larger anger which came from outside, from a group or another person. And there was this corresponding link. And I realized what I'm fighting out there is a battle for the good and for the true and the right actually is a representation of the struggle within me that I was not conscious of for the good and the right to grow. And somewhere along the way, perhaps you even realize that until I am able to overcome that tendency within me, I will never be able to overcome that outside me. Because as long as I have the seed of anger, the moment I meet somebody who's angry, I lose my control and get angry. And so quickly, through once this correspondence is made, the pattern of good and bad, or good and evil, and light and dark, and the play between is seen within us. And what do you need to do? You have to purify yourself, change yourself, if you are to be successful in the battle outside. And what does it lead to? So would begin his religio-ethical formations and his possibilities of spiritual experience. Still now, it was not directly a spiritual experience. It was still a religious, occult, vital intuition, and that's it. But the spiritual experience can begin only when all this clutter is purified and a direct experience of the divine is had. But for the purification, you have to have this religio-ethical formations which make the base pure. Otherwise, you may remain in that patch all along. I remember meeting again someone. He was an extraordinarily intelligent person, brilliant mind, one of the most abstract realm of ideas that he could articulate, which I was struggling to keep up with. And he had just come back, he said, because he was African American. He had just come back from a journey in Africa where he went to his village and met with the village medicine man, who took him into a cave where he did certain things and he had experiences of beings who materialized and etc. And hearing that, I was a little disappointed. But perhaps it was his first entry into something still deeper, because the intellect was so formed. I don't know whether there was anything deeper for the spiritual. But it was his first entry. And so I thought I needed to say something. And the way I articulated it to him was, because he was still full of that impact of that experience. I said, this is a first entry. These are beings, and there are many such beings. And then there are greater beings who are more pure, more wide, more free, more spiritual, more embracing, more loving, less in conflict. Because he was entering a world where there was good and bad and the struggle of good and bad. And there's something which is transcending that duality. And because he had the intellectual base, he caught those ideas. And then there is beyond that something which is eternal, infinite, and one indivisible reality. And this is the first entry point. One has to be careful not to stop short with it, but to keep going to that. He got that immediately, and he said he was grateful for that. But if in this first entry a breakthrough is made and he stops short with it, he would get lost in something which is unendingly complex, and then miss the opportunity to go deeper. But this idea of good and evil begins a religio-ethical formation which prepares for the spiritual. An amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, religious social ethics, mystical knowledge, or experiences symbolized in myth, but with their sense preserved by secret initiation and discipline, is the early, at first. So, phase of religion has all these elements. And the things which not touched, mystical knowledge or experiences symbolized in myth, but with their sense preserved by secret initiation and discipline. Inevitably, you end up with something which has a story form. How did this end up being what it is? There has to be a story behind. In Japan, we were taken to a cave which is the original cave where the deity came escaping from the gods when she had lost something, and she went into seclusion in the cave. And because she went into seclusion, all the universe began to fall into darkness, and the gods had to come to the cave to draw her out, and the whole story around that. And if you stop with the first part of the myth, you have something which doesn't make much sense. Here is somebody who can fly in the heavens, and she gets locked up in a cave and they have to call her out. Why can't they just go through the rock? You could put a very rational questioning. But obviously, the cave is not just a physical cave, and yet it has a physical location associated with it. And from her is the genesis of the first Japanese king and the whole lineage. So you have a story which connects to a physical line, and yet the story fades out into something which is non-physical. And you would say that's where we use the word mythology, myth, which represents a higher truth that joins with the physical reality, but there's a symbol somewhere in between which is quite might be quite lost. In India, unfortunately, so much of what is historical event has been dismissed by the period of colonial rule as myth. Mahabharata is myth, Ramayana is myth. And because there are elements in the story which involve interchange with divine beings. So the five Pandavas are born by Kunti using a mantra to invoke a divine being, and she becomes pregnant from that. And each of those Pandavas, therefore, is born of a divine being with a human mother. And they have something extraordinary. They are not ordinary human beings, they're exceptional. And there's a symbol there of each of them representing one of the five elements. And automatically, therefore, the five elements are symbolized in their fivefold births. And so when they marry, there's a peculiar circumstance of the story where they come with this queen that they have won. There's a challenge that they have completed. One of them has won. As they call out, look what we have brought. And she says, well, whatever it is, divide equally among all five. And now they're compelled to marry all five of them to this one woman. It doesn't make sense logically. You can just tell the mother, hey, watch out, we're talking for a person. But it is justified. The marriage is justified on the ground that they were told to share equally. And then there's a story behind that. When she prayed to Shiva, she, in her previous incarnation, she says to Shiva, I want a husband. And she repeats it with such desperation 5 times that Shiva grants it and says, all right, you have 5 husbands. So now in this life that is fulfilled. And so there's a whole complex mythic element to what is otherwise a historical narration. And it's difficult for the modern mind, which cannot accept that a god could be invoked by a mantra and actually cause her to give birth to a child. There has to be a biological interaction which cannot happen with a non-material entity. Or perhaps was it material? And so there are people who will interpret them as being extraterrestrial beings who were called, but you don't call extraterrestrial beings with a mantra. But in an occult knowledge, you would know also that a subtle being can materialize in human biological form, and even have a physical relation. And so there are many elements which we are not sure how to understand. So this allows the whole thing to be dismissed as entirely mythology. And yet the physical component of it is so physical you cannot deny it. So it seems almost as if there was a phase in human life or human history where the veil between the surface and the inner realms, or between the lower and the higher, was not so thick. And there was more easy exchange between them. And even for people to recognize, to be told that they gave birth from invocation of a divine being was acceptable. Or even a mantra existed that could be taught by which you could invoke. You see, so there's a whole realm which is quite different from the modern, very rational and reductionist materialistic mind. So all these elements can come. So he says an amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, religio-social ethics, mystical knowledge or experiences symbolized in myths. And you don't know anymore what is a symbol, what is real, because they bridge so seamlessly. But with their sense preserved by a secret initiation and discipline. So there will be traditions which will keep the secret of this. Maybe it will stick to the five fingers. Why? Because actually five fingers map to five elements, interestingly. And that's part of the occult knowledge of the qualitative, energetic quality of each of the fingers lining up with the five elements. And so when you join fingers, as you're taught in certain mudras, you're actually linking two different elements or combinations of three or four for specific results of health or shifts in states of consciousness. So there's a whole knowledge of yoga, which maps to the fingers and the energy flows in the subtle body, mapped now to a mythological format, which is also linked to a historical event, and you cannot separate these. And it can be given a very superficial form of the esoteric saying, well, to be effective, all five fingers must form a fist. Only when the five elements are united that you can be effective in action. Here's a deep spiritual truth formulated in a physical symbol linked to a historical event. You cannot separate the three. And this can be told to children. And deep truths communicated through these stories. And at the same time, the deeper aspect of those truths might be held in certain disciplines and secret initiation involved to protect that aspect, which could be either misused or would the knowledge you insulate it from a mind which is not ready to receive that knowledge. Until the human evolution brings the larger mass of humanity to a level of development where now this knowledge can be had directly. And we may say that we are at that stage. Because if we have not come to that stage, we are not yet ready for a spiritual age. As long as the spiritual experience has to be protected from corruption by an inferior consciousness, you cannot enter a spiritual age. And we are at that point where, yes, corruption will be there because there are parts of humanity or parts of our individual consciousness which are still crude and unrefined. But we have enough of us in numbers and in a part of development which is ready to make that contact or know that higher truth. And that's where you find Sri Aurobindo's writings to be so important. It is the first time in human history and the spiritual history of humanity that the highest spiritual knowledge has been given in such an open, direct, rational, and complete manner. All other traditions have the knowledge held in symbols, concealed, hidden, even the symbols lost sometimes, the key gone, and always limited and partial for that particular age, period, or domain. This is the first time that the knowledge is so complete, so because so universal and so essential that you can take this text onto another planet, another species, and all this would apply. It's that universal. And across history, across time, a million years from now, if a new Earth is born in some other solar system and a species emerges that is emerging into mental consciousness and preparing for a spiritual age, all that is written here would apply equally. It is so essential in its formulation with variations of form. And so complete, it touches everything in life. Nothing has been left out. And as we see, even the occult knowledge has been embedded, deeper truths of all these levels of gradation. And yet, although presented rationally, the content, the larger content of the knowledge is actually held in an intuitive consciousness that opens you to its source in the supramental. And that's why reading Sri Aurobindo, you find that your mind tends to become intuitivized. And through that intuitivization begins to perceive the higher ranges and the truth of those ranges, which he's describing in a rational manner. And so it becomes a passage, a stairway, picking up where we are in a rationally developed mind, and through the gateway of reason, rising through intuition to still higher experiences. And what happens when your mind becomes intuitivized as you read, you not only discover these deeper nuances and insights, but also you begin to perceive that which you're reading. The mother records how she saw Sri Aurobindo when he was writing the hymns to the mystic fire, translating these Vedic verses into English. She saw Agni standing before Sri Aurobindo. The very act of his writing and translating the verses invoked the full power of the deity that is Agni, and he stood before her, and she stood before him. That text has the power to invoke Agni, or to give you the direct experience of contact with Agni, or the other texts of Indra and his translation and other deities. When you read in Sri Aurobindo's Secret of the Veda, the description in various chapters of the principal deities, as he describes them, you can feel as if that consciousness begins to form in you. But you also recognize very quickly that your ability to receive the imprint is still very weak. And so there is a momentary lift and a shift. And then after a while it passes and the gates close. And then again it lifts and a greater shift, and then the gates close. But if you are persistent in all that he asks you to do, the mind can be sufficiently intuitivized that it opens and stays open, and then deepens and grows more and more complete until the full experience of that domain is actually had. If you read, for example, some of his translations of the Upanishads, first you read the text of the Upanishad in itself, or a casual, rational, intelligent translation, and you can see, yes, you can feel glimmers of light. And then you read the same thing the way Sri Aurobindo describes it, and you feel as if a whole world opens out. And then later, when this is sufficiently settled, you reread the Sanskrit verses. And as you read, it's as if you experience that world opening out. And this was prepared for by the rational study that you made of, the intelligent study that you made of Sri Aurobindo's writings, which bridged you to the intuitive experience. So the value of what he has written is so great. And its impact and value and worth will last many centuries. And as I've mentioned before, and it's worth repeating, he therefore has to address it not to the current mind of humanity. He has to start from there, but he has to address it to the future evolution of the human mind. That 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when the human mind is much more deepened and intuitivized, much larger and more flexible, this should still be helpful and no more something passé and not interesting anymore, as has happened to so many texts which have been written in the past, addressed only to the consciousness of that age. Here it takes you all the way to the highest supramental possibilities. And even from a liberated mind living in that consciousness, reading this would have an experience which would open possibilities. So this is where we will pause. I have digressed from this, or perhaps extended what we have read or completed it. But the secret initiation and discipline, which was necessary in the early age, is no more required, and therefore the knowledge revealed is complete and full, and yet not accessible unless your mind grows in consciousness. So you begin with what you can, with your current mind, and it's accessible at the first layer, and then you reread, and each time it is deeper and deeper. And he provides you the key. The initiation and the discipline is already inbuilt into the text itself. The means is given to you, and you have only to allow its unfoldment to lead you to the fullness of that knowledge, until someday, and this should be the ideal, at least from the aspect of knowledge, we should be able to experience all that he writes here the way Sri Aurobindo experienced it, the way he saw it. That should be the vision we should share in. And then we will see how beautifully he has formulated that vision, which otherwise we might not have been able to formulate so completely. So we will pause here. Since it is also a time when we are between the December 5th and the 9th. Mother's guideline was to use this time to dwell on the deeper purpose of our life, why we are here, and putting it in this context, to grow in consciousness, and the means given to us also for the growth in consciousness by Sri Aurobindo himself. If you recall the mother's epitaph is too crude a word, but I will say prayer to Sri Aurobindo, which is inscribed on the Samadhi, that we may never forget even for a moment all we owe to thee. And this is a small part of all we owe to thee. We can meditate on this for a few seconds before we leave.